Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Gene Panasenko here with Straight and Unfiltered. This is a channel where we speak with business owners, professionals, attorneys, agents, CPAs, all in an effort to really facilitate interaction between small businesses and corporate executives. We're fortunate here to have Charles McCormick, which is an attorney based out of New York City, Midtown Manhattan. And again, Charles has been in business for quite a few years. And Charles, welcome to the channel.
Thanks, Gene. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, Charles. So again, I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with you in some capacities over years, over time, and I know that you've been bringing some very substantial value to the clients with your level of expertise, advice. So why don't you share with the audience, how long you've been in business, what kind of practice you're on, and your clients.
So McCormick OBrien was formed in January of 2004. Our other named partner, my partner, Liam O'Brien, who runs our dispute resolution group, was a college classmate of mine. And I guess that's one of the first pointers I give for anyone who's thinking about starting a business, is that you should know who it is you're doing business with. And obviously, Liam and I knew each other for many, many years before we started this business. We started in 2004, so I guess that means we're in our 17th year. We have two principal practice groups. The first, as I mentioned, is the litigation group, and that's commercial disputes with particular specialty in the financial services industry, which is cases that are brought before and involve the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA. That is the self-regulatory organization that governs the broker-dealer industry, less formally known as Wall Street. My group is the corporate group. We advise companies and investment funds on a wide variety of corporate transactions. And one way to think about it is anywhere that your business interacts with the law, we seek to provide legal advice. So that's us in a nutshell.
Well, that's an excellent, again, response to the question, Charles. Definitely appreciate it. In the environment which is becoming more and more complex, I know because, again, in my line of business, we're dealing with an awful lot of regulations. In your opinion, what are you seeing, happening in the last few years? Do we get more regulations that the businesses, from startups to existing, corporate entities, they need to comply with, or you're seeing reduction of those regulations and the ease of doing business?
Well, I think that would probably be its own topic, Gene. So I'll give you just a few snippets.
Right.
And so earlier I mentioned FINRA.
Right.
Now, FINRA in its current form is a relatively new organization. I think it's no more than 10 or 15 years old, but I didn't have a chance to prepare for that before this session. FINRA was formed by the merger of two predecessor organizations, the National Association of Securities Dealers, or NASD, and another organization whose name escapes me. And at the time of the merger, there were a number of people in the community who observed that one of the purposes for the merger was to weed out smaller organizations within the financial services industry. And the reason was because the compliance costs of maintaining your registration and complying with all the regulations was going to be so prohibitive that a small organization wouldn't be able to realistically meet those obligations. You couple that with the observation, and really not the observation, but the fact that 80% of registered broker-dealers in the United States have fewer than 10 employees. Now think about that for a second, Gene. A well-known broker-dealer might be Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley. Those organizations have hundreds of employees. JP Morgan, same thing. They don't have hundreds. They actually have tens of thousands of employees. A great number, an increasing number of those employees are in the compliance field. And so, for example, when you read a report that JP Morgan hired 15,000 new employees in a given quarter, more often than not, what that means is that JP Morgan hired 25,000 compliance people and fired 10,000 bankers for a net gain of 15,000. Now, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point is the same, that the compliance environment in financial services and other areas has gotten a lot more demanding. And there's two sides of that. One is that we need that so that we can prevent another WorldCom, another Enron, the catastrophes at the beginning of the 21st century that gave rise to what we now call the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Rolling the movie forward a little bit, we also want to prevent the tragedies that occurred in 2008 and 2009 with what's now known as the subprime debacle. And so whenever we have one of these dramatic episodes, it's fair to expect that the government response is going to be toward greater regulation rather than less regulation. But it's a pendulum that swings both ways. And so if you're watching any political campaign, it's not just this year, it goes back at least as early, at least to the beginning of my lifetime. A very popular political position is to identify yourself as the candidate who will reduce regulation and who will get the government out of business. And that works. I think probably the most emblematic example of that sentiment is Ronald Reagan, who is today still remembered for his famous line that the most dangerous words in the English language are, "Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
Well, and another great line of Ronald Reagan, if you remember, Charles, the government is not a solution, it's a problem, right?
Exactly. So the pendulum swings both ways. And I think recently what we've seen in some industries is increased regulations. And I think you've seen the criticism of increased regulations that it discourages and dampens innovation. And let's take financial services as an example, just because that happens to be where we are. One of the trends that we're seeing in venture capital and entrepreneurial activity is a trend that is known as distributed finance, or DeFi. And examples of that would be cryptocurrency. Examples of that would be lending and offering credit products to those who might not have traditionally qualified under applicable credit review scores, right? So your FICO score essentially determines whether or not you're going to get a credit card, whether or not you're going to get a home mortgage, what your rate's going to be, what your credit limit's going to be. And there is an entire industry that is premised on the idea that the existing system is completely ridiculous. And so when you put those two trends together, it is true that both there is a lot more regulation in financial services, particularly in the banks and the brokerages. But the flip side of it is that this is a time right now when there has been enormous innovation by very small players. And companies that we think of as very big players right now, Robinhood being an example, started out the same way that any number of companies started out, two guys in a room with a really good idea. And so the typical argument that regulation dampens innovation just may not be supported empirically. I heard someone say once that some of the greatest entrepreneurs of their generation, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, Craig McCaw, New York's own Mike Bloomberg, started their companies at a time when capital gains rates were at least twice what they are now. And so the argument that if we raise capital
And the
gains rates,
interest
people,
rates to get a loan were
sure,
in the
yeah,
double digits. I mean, Paul
yeah,
Volcker, remember the days, 15, 16, 17% interest rate, that's per annum,
that's
per
right.
year, just to
That's
get a
right.
loan. And
So,
you can just imagine putting yourself in a position where you're trying to launch the business as a startup, and paying 17, 18% per year in interest alone. That's preposterous by
yeah,
today's standards. Where the people are getting, 2, 3% rate, and they're not happy. They're still shopping, trying to save an eighth a percentage point.
yeah. So, there's arguments on both sides, and I don't necessarily have the answer. What I know is that entrepreneurship is increasingly popular. And I think that's always the case. I think the younger generation, they say the millennials are extremely entrepreneurial, but I'm not a millennial.
Neither
And
am I.
when I was their age, I probably would have resembled that remark. And I have a suspicion, Mike Bloomberg's not a millennial, but he probably fits that mold. Larry Ellison, Craig McCaw, they fit those molds.
Right.
And so, the idea that regulation controls innovation just isn't empirically true. It obviously can make innovation easier or harder. But the flip side of that is that when innovation becomes too easy, you have a lot of good money chasing a lot of bad ideas. And that presented itself to our society in what we now know as the dot-com bust, where you had companies that were going public with no history of profits, no current profits, and candidly, no hope of any profits, and getting billion-dollar public valuations. And if you contrast that to the companies that are going public today, the Palantirs of the world, that just went public this week, and any number of these companies, they're real businesses, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they are making profits hand over fist. But what it means is that they have proven products, proven services, proven business models. They're generating revenues, and the rate of revenues are increasing in some cases dramatically. And that's a deep contrast to some, but not all of the companies that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century in that folded in the dot-com bust. So, there's no simple answer that governs all situations. I think regulation is necessary until it's not. Regulation is beneficial until it's not. Innovation is helpful until it's not. So there are people who will point to the fact that productivity in the United States has not increased with the dawn of the technology and the computer age as much as one would have expected. And if you compare it to earlier periods in US history with innovations like the steam engine and the railroad, I think you'll find that, as just a pure mathematical matter, productivity increased a lot more than it's increased with the computer. So there are limits to innovation and entrepreneurship, and there are limits to regulation.
So true, so true. Charles, I know that a huge number of clients that both yourself and myself separately, we've been advising and servicing, they're small businesses that really represent, the bulk of the US economy. I know also that you had a very successful practice with New York Startup Academy. I'd like to speak about the academy. I would like to speak about how you took that entity from just a few hundred, members to really thousands and thousands of people. Some of the businesses that grew into something which is pretty sizable and pretty successful, in my opinion. So let's talk about that.
So NYC Startup Academy is an organization, a community for entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs. And I want to focus on that latter part first. So what is an aspiring entrepreneur? An aspiring entrepreneur is someone who is very well educated, often highly trained at large organizations, whether that be JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs in financial services, or Google or Oracle or Apple in information technology, or any number of your Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Pfizer, pharmaceuticals, but they fit a certain profile. They tend to be younger professionals. They tend to be very ambitious. A number of them aren't really satisfied with their big corporate job. and are excited at the prospect of becoming an entrepreneur, but aren't quite sure how to get there. And maybe that's because they have deep technical experience, but have never had a sales and marketing class and don't know how to go about selling a product. Or maybe it's because they're expert salespeople, but don't know how to code. So their own self-assessment is that they would love to be an entrepreneur, but don't feel that their toolkit is complete. So NYC Startup Academy helps them in two ways. Number one, it helps them to build their toolkit. And the way that we do that is we conduct monthly live events, not since March because of COVID, but monthly live events that you've attended, where we try to bring in subject matter experts or entrepreneurs who have built companies, are building companies, and can tell their story, in order to give aspiring entrepreneurs actionable intelligence about how it is they can become an entrepreneur and build their company. And then the other benefit of NYC Startup Academy is that it is a community of like-minded people seeking others. And so, in my example, someone who has a deep coding background who needs a salesperson might come to Startup Academy, and through that might meet someone who has a great sales background but can't code. And through just your normal networking process, they might discover that they share a number of ideas, common vision with respect to a particular business, and that they may have a personality fit that enables them to form a partnership and to pursue that idea. And so those are really the goals of Startup Academy. And you're very kind to mention the success that we've had. So I took over the Startup Academy, I believe, in January of 2017. It had been formed, I don't know by who.
It was the first time when I actually came to join one of your events, and it's amazing to see the progress. I mean, that exponential growth that you've been able to deliver and grow that from the embryonic pretty much stage, into what it became over years. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we started when I took over the group. The group had about 126 members, and had never done an event. And today we have thousands of members. And until COVID, we did an event every month, the third or fourth Wednesday of the month, from 6 to 8 p.m. And I want to thank our sponsor, Citron Cooperman, for being so gracious with its not just its resources, but also with its space, and giving us a terrific venue for conducting and hosting NYC Startup Academy. So great shout out to Citron Cooperman for that. But the proof is in the pudding. So the reason that NYC Startup Academy has remained relevant, and the reason that it has grown so much, is because it provides something that the market needs. And essentially that is the essence of entrepreneurship, right? If you can provide something that's missing in the market that it needs in a way that's affordable, accessible, understandable, then you can be an entrepreneur. And so NYC Startup Academy, by the same token, took an entrepreneurial approach to a networking community. And the success, as you've mentioned, is reflected in the level of participation.
Those are excellent points, Charles. I personally want to attest that I attended quite a few meetings, as you know well, and I found them extremely helpful, very informative, between the speakers, the panels that you have been organizing, on a pretty much regular basis. I wish I could be attending more of those events, but again, I do my own events with my clients and have to attend, other venues, other places as well. But at the same time, I personally made incredible number of very helpful contacts. Some of them they developed into very good relationships. And I personally feel very strongly that the NYC Startup Academy has been able to provide a very good platform for not just aspiring, startup businesses, but existing people and existing businesses like myself. I've been a financial advisor for over 24 years now. Time flies painfully fast, as we can both attest. But it's always nice to, meet interesting people, like-minded professionals with whom we can exchange ideas, network, to see how as a team, we can provide better value, by taking that holistic approach. We both know that we can be geniuses in our lines of business, but without legal protection, no business can function, for any reasonable amount of time. And I lost track of how many times I would come across, businesses. It's either a one-man show or two guys or two ladies, that have some informal partnership, but they don't have anything legal in place. And it's beyond me how they cannot invest some time and money, yes, because unfortunately advice does cost money, to sit down with an attorney and speak about the legal structure as opposed to running the practice as a sole proprietor, or have some partnership agreement formed with buy-sell agreement in place. I've seen countless number of cases where, again, businesses would not have those kind of things in place, and that eventually very often would lead to a demise of the business. So can you talk about a couple of examples from your practice why having those kind of things in place would be critically important for the business?
Yeah, in fact, I really appreciate that lead in, Gene, because that leads me to the founder accord. And so probably about 5 or 6 years ago, a client came into my office with more or less this fact pattern. He said, listen, I have been advising these guys with their startup for about a year. And they're very good with some things, but they're not so good with other things. And I'm really good with that.
Right.
And so I've been really helping them out. I've been introducing them to people. And, all along, I've kept my day job, and they've offered me time and time again, why don't you join us? Why don't we be partners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, that conversation continued, and I continued to help them. And they continued to make all these promises to the point where my client felt that he understood what his deal was. And his deal involved a full-time role at a certain salary and a certain amount of equity. And, recognition, and this is very important in the entrepreneurial community, recognition as a co-founder along with the guys he'd been advising. You roll the movie forward, and they finally get a substantial amount of financing. Enough that my client decided, well, you know what, I've been helping these guys for long enough. I've added a lot of value. They've made a very fair offer to me. I think I'm going to leave my job and join this new company full-time as a co-founder. And he tells the guys he's been working with this, and they say, great, that's fantastic. We should get the lawyers involved, and, here's the paperwork, and, just sign this and we're good to go. And he brings, he looks at it, and it's a stack of papers about this thick. And he doesn't know, he can't make heads or tails out of it. So he brings it to me.
Right.
And I look at it and I say, oh, this is very nice. Yeah, it's great. What were your expectations? And he tells me his expectations. And then I have to tell him, as he was sitting down at the time, so I didn't have to say, I hope you're sitting down. I said, well, that's not what you're being offered. And he started correcting me. He said, no, that's exactly what I was offered.
He's correcting you, actually. He is telling you
all these things. And I said, look, I'm not trying to pick a fight here, but I'm just telling you what the agreements say.
Yeah.
And, I used to call this, I said to him, yours is not an unfamiliar problem. I used to call it a Pete Best problem.
Yeah.
After the drummer of the Beatles, who was replaced before the Beatles became really famous by Ringo Starr.
Right.
So he's kind of the fifth founder who kind of get kicked out before things got really interesting. But, fortunately or unfortunately for Reggie Brown, I no longer refer to it as Pete Best problem. So Reggie Brown was one of the original contributors to what is now Snap, who in a lot of people's assessment was really the brains behind the company. And for whatever reason that I don't know, he was pushed out of the company. And really, until he complained, didn't get anything. So, this is now known as a Reggie Brown problem. So he's telling me all this, and I'm listening. And I had to tell him, look, you've got a terrible choice here, right? You can not sign the papers, in which case I understand you're just out.
Right.
Or you can sign the papers, in which case I understand you will get a much worse deal than you were expecting, and you'll have agreed to it. So I don't have a good answer for you here. He said, oh, I want to sue them. And I said, well, you could do that, but what's the basis of your lawsuit?
Right.
Some emails that you guys exchanged, some conversations that you guys had. That's going to be a tough case in court. So I created the founder accord specifically for this problem. And the idea behind the founder accord, imagine, 3 or 4 guys who meet at NYC Startup Academy and each have complementary skills and each have other things going on. And maybe several of them are actually working on a number of startups simultaneously. That's not uncommon these days. They think they might have something, but they know about what can happen. They know about Reggie Brown. They know about Eduardo Saverin. And they're thinking to themselves, well, I like this idea, but I don't really know this other guy or these other guys. And, I'm not sure how much I really want to devote myself to this project if I'm not really clear legally on what I get if it works out. And as you were saying, you need to get lawyers involved. Well, the problem is that's expensive. And so
this is the common objection I keep hearing, because again, my job as a financial advisor is to make sure that we have the whole team in place, which is taking a holistic approach, and we're protecting the client and we're advising a client, on the most comprehensive level. And unfortunately, I'm seeing a very disproportionate allocation of funding to pay for the legal advice as opposed to the rest of the budget. Yeah. And the advice is common, hey, we can't afford it. And my response is always, hey, if anything else, you cannot afford not to have this kind of advisor.
That's right.
Because it will protect the whole thing going forward. Yeah.
But the observation is that at the early stage, I like to give the example. If I received 5 business plans in 1994 for selling books on the internet, there is absolutely no way I would have been able to identify Amazon as the clear winner. In fact, if I think back to that time, there were these companies like Barnes & Noble and Borders that were already selling books. And Barnes & Noble was extremely popular. It was almost a place to hang out socially for young people. So
the cafes, where the people
it's
would be
hard to
hanging out for
imagine.
hours.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine at the time that they were going to be the guys, these guys at Amazon were going to be the guys who made it. Or, when Facebook launched, there was a company called MySpace that
remember that very well as well.
Time, just owned the industry. And, it's one of these things where, if someone came to you today with an idea for a search engine company, you would think to yourself, well, how are these guys going to compete with Google? And, the same logic would have applied. Back when Facebook was launched, I'm sure that people would have told them, well, how in the world are you going to compete with MySpace? I mean,
remember it's very, very well. Yes, so much argument has been made. Yeah.
So, so the idea is that every time you come up with a good idea, you don't necessarily want to form a corporation and hire lawyers and, do everything that you really should be doing.
Have some partnership agreement, buy-sell agreement. What happens if your partner gets sued by the truck tomorrow? You're going to get sued by the beneficiaries, by his family, asking for a half, whatever his stake has been in the company. Yeah,
if I knew today how my company was going to be doing in 5 years, I would be able to instantly make an assessment whether it was a worthwhile investment, but no one can do that. And so we created the Founder Accord specifically to enable founders and prospective founders to work together and collaborate prior to the formal incorporation and ramping up and bringing in all the lawyers, so to speak, of a company, in a way that they would have comfort that if that did move forward, they would have some protection. But the real thinking behind the Founder Accord is this, and I lay this out. This is on our website that I'm sure you can make available. And the real thinking is this, that people will say commonly that 80% of new businesses fail, and I don't disagree with that. But the question is, why do they fail? And one of the reasons that I think they fail is that people don't devote the resources to something in its nascent stages because they don't know what the payoff is. And so what you have, if you think about it, are false negatives. And so if you look at the venture capital industry writ large, you could take the position that the job of a venture capitalist in selecting portfolio companies is to weed out false positives. And
True.
those are guys who pitch you that they have the next Google, the next Pfizer, the next Oracle, the next this, the next that, right? But, in reality don't, because that's not really easy to do. But the truth of the matter is, I think the better VCs are always alert to the false negatives. And those are companies or even ideas that have tremendous potential, but don't get developed because the founders aren't comfortable devoting the resources that are required to make it a success. Because no matter how good an idea you have, no matter how great a team you have, and no matter how great your timing in the market is, it's always going to require a lot of effort to succeed. And sports is a great example of that. So if you look at your most talented athletes, the NBA is great because they're all so tall. And so to be an NBA player, you first of all have to have the good fortune of being 6 feet 8 inches tall, and that's fantastic. But I think what gets missed in that is the guys who are 6 feet 8 inches tall work incredibly hard to hone their skills and to protect and to perfect their craft. And the reason is that in much the same way that just being particularly tall isn't enough to make you an NBA superstar, just having a great idea, just having great timing, just having the right team in place doesn't guarantee you success. And with a lot of people, it's opportunity cost. So I could have been a great NBA player, but I got my CPA. Well, that's not an irrational move to make, right? Or I could have developed this business, but instead I went to business school. I could have developed this business, but instead I took a promotion at Wells Fargo. That's not a dumb idea. It's a lot, the way I explain it, it's a lot easier to explain to your aunt that you got promoted at Citibank than it is that you quit your job after 4 years of college because you wanted to start up a business with some guy from the Ukraine who you just met. So what the Founder Accord does on a little bit larger level is it addresses the issue of false negatives. And the theory is that within that universe of false negatives, there are a lot of really fantastic companies that fail for the wrong reasons. That fail not because they're not great ideas, not because they're not timely, not because they're not well executed, but because they don't get the attention that they deserve. And hopefully the Founder Accord will align incentives correctly, that founders will devote the energy and the effort that's required to make a successful business, which at the end of the day benefits everybody.
Excellent points, Charles. Thanks so much for sharing them. Just wanted to give our audience an idea of some of the clients that you have been advising over time. And one of the biggest names I can think of is Benny VC.
Sure.
So you want to speak just briefly without going into details, of your relationship with the company and the level of their activities. Yeah.
Benny VC is an early stage venture fund that's about 3 years old and has made at this point about 16 or 17 investments. It is a diversified early stage venture fund. It was founded by my good friend Ciro Campagnoli, who comes from a real estate background, but was always intrigued by innovation and venture. And was so much so that he created Benny VC in order to capitalize on the number of opportunities that have arisen in the market since it began. And this period that we're in right now, and I'm not talking about COVID, but the last 10 or 15 years have been just a tremendous environment for innovation. And if you think about what's going on in data, in genomics, in autonomous vehicles, in artificial intelligence, in blockchain, in any number of these industries that have frankly become buzzwords because they're so common and because they're so enticing, and to a lesser extent because no one really understands what they are. This is a terrific time to be an energetic young entrepreneur. And Chiro saw that coming from an industry that, frankly, isn't really known for innovation. Real estate is viewed, I think, by financial advisors, and I think rightly, as a safe, secure, stable, maybe even stodgy industry that isn't really known for great innovation. So Chiro's personality is the opposite, and he's been tremendously successful in real estate and wanted to do something that really catered to his interests. And that's where Benny VC comes in. And I think Benny VC's premise is very much that to benefit from the success of entrepreneurship, you need to look at companies in their earliest stages. And who wouldn't have wanted to invest in Facebook in 2004? Who wouldn't have wanted to invest in Google in 1999? These would have been just tremendous investments. I'm sure in your industry, your clients ask you, well, how have I done relative to S&P, right? If the S&P was up 6%, Gene, I'm sure your clients are all up 8 or 9%. But what if you could tell your clients, wow, you're up 15,000%. So those are the opportunities that investing in a very successful, ultimately early stage company can afford. And if you look at what some of the legendary venture capital firms have done in terms of returns, what you'll find is that their greatest returns were in companies where they got in very early. And those returns are just astronomical. In other words, it's not even, it's almost nonsensical to try to measure the returns using normal metrics, right? So a normal metric might be, X% or X% above S&P. These are companies that do way, way more than that. Now, of course, there's a trade-off, because if you invest in 100 real estate companies in 5 years, probably 100 of them will still be around. Maybe not, but certainly most of them will still be around. If you invest in 100 early stage companies, in 5 years, if you're lucky, maybe 4 or 5 of them will still be around, and the rest of them will have completely failed. And that just sounds ominous, right? In the example that I gave, there's a 95 or a 96% failure rate. So ask yourself, would you get on a plane that had a 95% chance of crashing? Probably not. And yet that's the venture capital industry. And here's the silver lining. Those 4 or 5 companies in my example that do make it, make up for all the losses in the earlier companies. Because, and it's just simple arithmetic. If you invest $1 million, you know that your downside is limited to $1 million, but your upside is unlimited. And so if you invest $1 million and 95% of those companies, or $950,000 of your money, goes to zero, you've lost $950,000. But if those 5 companies do remarkably well, that $50,000 could become $50 million, $500 million. And so if you look at the portfolio as a whole, what you'll see is that 2 or 3%, maybe 5% of companies in any given portfolio in the venture space, not in the larger space, but in the venture space, make up for anywhere between 90 and 100% of a portfolio's returns. And so that's what Benny VC is after. And that's really Ciro Campagnoli's vision for Benny VC. And, thus far, it's a 3-year-old fund. I don't believe it's had any exits, but it's had a number of companies, a number of which are based right here in New York. A good example would be Rhino, which was Benny VC's initial investment that is changing the way that people rent an apartment. And so, when I was looking for an apartment in New York City, I knew that if I found an apartment that I liked, I had to write a check to the landlord of 1, or in my case, 2 months as a security deposit. And that was money that
That
I
was
wouldn't
not a bad
see.
deal because a lot of times they're asking for 3 or 4 months.
Sure, yeah, and that's money that I couldn't use and money that I wouldn't see until the end of the lease. And so I wish at the time someone would have said to me, you know what, Charles, don't write me a security deposit. You're going to pay $10 or $15 more a month in rent. Is that okay? Well, I guess that's okay. And you don't have to give me a security deposit. What a great proposition. Well, that's Rhino. So, and that's New York based. Acern is New York based. This is a data company. It's a big data company. And I told you that's an emerging trend that takes all the different sources of data in a large organization. And think about that. You know, you've got your faxes that come in, and then you've got your emails, and then you've got your regular mail, and you've got this database that the sales and marketing guys have, and you've got this database that the accountants have, but they don't talk to one another. What if you could integrate all of that? That's a CERN. And there are a number of
some
these
truly
companies.
fascinating trends, living through
Yeah.
some very exciting times.
And these are New York City based.
Yeah, absolutely.
Link Technology was Benny VC's most recent investment. Link Technologies is based in Brooklyn. It has created a communications device that works outside of a grid, outside of an internet grid or anything like that. So
we
if
just
you're
had a
hiking-
horrendous hurricane, as we all know, just a few
Yeah.
weeks back, and then the grid was basically,
That's right. If
was
the grid
gone.
goes
Some of the
down,
places have been out of power for days or weeks, so that would be
Mhm.
probably
or if you go outside of the grid, let's say that you're hiking in the wilderness
right.
and there are no cell towers and there's no connectivity and you get lost, you're out of luck. But if you have the Link product, then you're able to communicate with the world.
Yeah, the evolution of some industries is nothing
Mhm.
short of amazing.
Yeah.
I do want to point out to our esteemed audience that we're not distributing any legal or investment advices here. We're just having a general conversation for
Wouldn't
anything
think of it,
specific.
yeah.
Obviously,
Yeah.
they do need to get in touch with their attorneys and financial advisors because
Yeah.
everything should be customized and tailored to
But that's,
everybody.
I apologize if I went off script, but that's what Benny
No,
VC
absolutely. I
is
mean,
focused on. I'm really excited about what Ciro Campagnoli is doing with that fund.
absolutely, Charles. Absolutely. So, if somebody is looking to retain your legal services, get your expertise, either it comes down to, getting a business formation or startup or anything more complex for the existing corporations that you've been advising for many, many years. You want to share your address, email address, phone number, and then we're going to also put it in the link below in the description. So go ahead, please, Charles.
Yeah, I think the best way to reach me, Gene, is through you. But our website is mcoblaw.com, and I'm reachable on LinkedIn, and happy to chat with anyone who who has a question where law and business interact.
Excellent, Charles. Well, thank you so much again for getting on this channel. I hope our audience is going to find your thoughts helpful in getting their businesses going and taking them to the next level. And I do hope that this lockdown will end shortly so we can resume our regular day-to-day activities. And I can see you at one of the events. Either it's going to be Chamber of Commerce or Startup Academy event. So again, Charles, thanks very much, and then best wishes. Okay.
Thank you, Gene.
Until
It was
soon.
great speaking
Thank
with
you,
you
Charles.
today.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you very much.